Good day and welcome to Topic 1 of Introduction to Politics Foundations of Political Science. Every day, decisions made far away from your own kitchen table end up shaping what's on it. Whether a school stays open, what the minimum wage is set at, or which medicines get approved. All of these are political questions settled through political processes, whether we follow the news closely or not. In this lecture, we'll build a systematic framework for analyzing who gets what, when, and how. We'll move through 5 stops. First, the phenomenon of politics itself. Second, the closely related ideas of policy, power, and the public interest. Third, political science as an academic discipline. Fourth, its research methods and levels of analysis. And finally, we'll pull it all together with an applied case study. By the end of this lecture, you should be able to talk about politics with far more precision than simply saying, quote, politics is just people arguing, end quote. Everything we cover today is the toolkit the rest of this course builds on, so it's worth sitting with these ideas carefully. Let's begin with the phenomenon itself. What actually is politics? Ask 10 different people to define politics, and you will likely get 10 different answers. Some point to elections and government, others describe politics as conflict, compromise, or even corruption. The most durable definition in the discipline comes from the American political scientist Harold Laswell, who in 1936 described politics as, quote, the process through which decisions are made about who gets what, when, and how, end quote. This deceptively simple phrase captures the essence of political life. Politics is fundamentally about distributing scarce and valued things, such as wealth, rights, opportunities, protection, and status, among people and groups who often want different, incompatible outcomes. We can break Laswell's framework into 4 connected questions. Who asks which individuals or groups are involved? For example, taxpayers or an industry lob? Why? What asks what is actually being distributed, such as money, rights, land, or services? When asks at what point the distribution occurs, for instance, a tax benefit phased in over several years. And how asks through what mechanism the decision is made, whether that's legislation, a court ruling, or an executive order. Later, political scientists often add a fifth question to Laswell's original 4. Why? Why does a particular group get what it gets, and why does the process play out the way it does? That why question is really what the rest of this course tries to answer. 2 other thinkers offer complementary views. David Easton defined politics as the authoritative allocation of values for a society, emphasizing that political decisions carry binding, society wide force. And centuries earlier, Aristotle argued that human beings are, in his words, zoon politikon, political animals, who can only achieve the good life through collective decision making in the life of the city state. Notice that this definition of politics is broader than simply, quote, what governments do, end quote. It applies anywhere scarce. Valued things must be divided among people with competing claims, whether that's a national legislature deciding how to spend tax revenue or a family deciding how to divide an inheritance. If politics is the process of deciding who gets what, then public policy is one of its most visible outputs. A public policy is a deliberate course of action, or at times a deliberate inaction, adopted by a government to address a problem of public concern. You can think of this as a pipeline running from problem to policy. It starts with a public problem, a societal issue requiring attention, like traffic congestion on an overcrowded highway. That problem moves into a stage of power and contestation, where competing claims and negotiations play out among political actors. Think of candidates debating on a stage. Eventually, this contestation produces a public policy, the formal government decision, whether that's a signed piece of legislation or a new regulation, and finally, that policy results in an actual resource or rights distribution, the tangible allocation of who gets what, such as funding that determines how many teachers are in a classroom. Hmm. Public policies take many forms: laws passed by a legislature, regulations issued by an agency, budgets that fund some programs and not others, or court rulings that establish binding legal principles. The key idea to hold on to is that policy doesn't appear out of nowhere. It is the endpoint of a political process that begins with a problem and is shaped at every step by power. Take a minimum wage increase. For example, the public problem is stagnant low income wages. The contestation happens between business groups and labor advocates. The policy is the amended law that finally passes, and the distribution is the actual pay raise that workers see in their next paycheck. That brings us to the concept underlying both policy and the public interest: power. Power is the capacity of one actor to influence the behavior, beliefs, or circumstances of another actor with or without that actor's consent, a definition associated with the political scientist Robert Dahl. Power isn't just one thing, it operates through at least three distinct mechanisms. Let's use a single scenario, collecting taxes, to see the difference. First, coercion, compelling behavior through threat or punishment. A citizen pays taxes solely to avoid the threat of imprisonment. Second, influence, persuading through argument, incentive, or example. A citizen pays taxes after seeing a public campaign showing how tax revenues fund local schools. And third, authority, power that is treated as rightful or legitimate by those subject to it. A citizen pays taxes simply because they accept that the government has an inherent right to collect the M. All three mechanisms can produce the exact same outcome. The tax gets paid, but only the third, authority, reflects legitimate power rather than raw coercion or persuasion. Distinguishing these three matters because political scientists are often less interested in whether power was exercised and more interested in how. We'll return to this question of legitimate authority later in the course when we look at citizens' rights and their relationship with the state. Public policy is typically justified by an appeal to the public interest, the idea that some outcomes benefit society as a whole, not merely a narrow faction. But the public interest is a genuinely contested concept, and political scientists use three distinct frameworks to diagnose who actually shapes it. The first is pluralism. Pluralists argue that many competing organized groups form coalitions and bargain with one another, and that this open competition among groups produces a reasonable approximation of the public good. The second is elitism. Elitists counter that a small, resource rich elite, whether economic, political, or social, disproportionately shapes policy outcomes, and that formal democratic procedures can mask deeply unequal real influence over those outcomes. The third is public choice theory. Why? Public choice theorists apply economic reasoning to politics, arguing that self interested officials, bureaucrats, and voters are the ones who actually shape outcomes, because political actors, like market actors, respond rationally to incentives such as re election or growing their agency's budget. None of these three frameworks is simply correct or incorrect on its own. They're competing lenses, and which one fits best often depends on the specific policy you're looking at. Part of your job as a student of politics is learning to diagnose that for yourself, case by case. Having looked at politics as a phenomenon, let's turn to political science as a discipline. Politics has been discussed and argued about for as long as organized human communities have existed. Political science is a more recent and more disciplined undertaking, the systematic study of politics using rigorous concepts, theories, and methods, so that claims about political life can be examined and tested rather than simply asserted. Aristotle is often considered an early forerunner, having systematically compared the constitutions of over 100 Greek city states in the 4th century before the Common Era. But political science professionalized as an academic discipline much later, from the late 19th century onward. Today, the discipline is organized into several major subfields. Political theory examines foundational concepts and values, asking questions like what makes political authority legitimate? W. Comparative politics studies political systems across multiple countries, asking, for example, why some democracies remain stable while others collapse. American politics studies the institutions and processes of one country's system in depth. International relations studies interaction among states and global actors, asking what causes war between states. Public policy and administration studies the design, implementation, and management of policy, asking whether a given welfare program actually reduces poverty. And political methodology develops the quantitative and qualitative tools political scientists use to gather and analyze evidence in the first place, from designing a survey to running a statistical model. As you move through this course, you'll notice most of our topics map onto one or more of these subfields. Ideology and rights connect closely to political theory, while elections and government institutions connect to comparative and American politics. Within every one of those subfields, political scientists ask two very different kinds of questions, and it's essential to be able to tell them apart. The first mode is normative political science. Its core question is what should be the case? Its method is philosophical argument and ethical reasoning, and its standard of success is the strength and coherence of an argument measured against standards of justice. A normative example would be should voting be compulsory? These questions can't be settled just by gathering more data because they turn on values and principles, not only facts. The second mode is empirical political science. Its core question is what is actually the case? Its method is observation, data collection, and statistical or comparative analysis. S. Empirical political science was driven historically by the mid 20th century behavioralism movement, which insisted on studying observable political behavior through data alongside rational choice theory, which models political actors as rational decision makers weighing costs and benefits. The standard of success here is the fit between a claim and the observable evidence. Notice the empirical version of our voting question is different in kind. Does compulsory voting increase turnout? That is a testable claim about an actual effect, not a question of value. This distinction connects directly back to the subfields we just discussed. Political theory operates mostly on the normative side, while comparative politics, international relations, and political methodology lean heavily empirical. Keeping normative and empirical questions distinct is one of the most important habits of mind this course will ask you to build. Our fourth stop is a framework political scientists use to organize any study of politics, the levels of analysis. A single political event, an election, a war, a new law, can be analyzed from several different vantage points at once, and these nest inside one another like a set of frames. At the innermost level is the individual level, which focuses on the psychology, beliefs, and choices of single actors, a voter deciding how to mark a ballot or a president making a decision. Around that is the group level, which focuses on organized collections such as political parties or labor unions competing for influence, for example, through a protest march. Around that is the institutional level, which focuses on the formal rules of the game, constitutions, legislatures, and electoral systems, like the chamber of a national parliament, that T. And the outermost level is the international level, which focuses on interactions among states and global organizations, such as the deliberations inside the United Nations General Assembly. Here's the key insight. No single level tells the whole story of a political event. A national election, for instance, can be studied at the individual level by asking why one voter chose a particular candidate. At the group level, by asking how a coalition of interest groups mobilized turnout. At the institutional level, by asking how the electoral system shaped which parties won seats. And at the international level, by asking how foreign governments reacted to the outcome. No single level tells the complete story on its own, which is exactly why political scientists are trained to move between them deliberately rather than getting stuck on just one. Keep this frame in mind because in a moment we're going to apply it together with everything else we've covered today to a single real world case. Let's close by pulling every concept from this lecture together into a single case. Consider a proposed national law that requires social media platforms to remove specific content within 24 hours or face heavy fines. After intense lobbying, the law passes, but in a modified form with a slower timeline and an independent appeals board. First, apply Laswell's framework. Who? Tech companies on one side, the public on the other. What? Control over online speech and the risk of steep fines. How? Through legislation, amended along the way, through political negotiation. Second, apply our two modes of inquiry. A normative question here would be, should governments have the authority to compel private companies to remove content? That's a question of value. An empirical question would be, does the new appeals board actually reduce uneven enforcement against smaller companies? That's a testable claim we could go measure. Third, apply two of our levels of analysis. As at the group level, we would study how tech companies and civil liberties organizations lobbied to shape the final text of the law. At the institutional level, we would study how the legislative process itself and the structural rules of the new appeals board constrain how the law gets enforced going forward. This single case shows why we needed every tool from today's lecture. Laswell's framework to describe what's at stake, the normative empirical distinction to sort out what kind of question we're asking, and the levels of analysis to decide whose behavior actually explains the outcome. That's what it means to study politics systematically. And it's a far more demanding and far more useful habit of mind than simply having an opinion. In our next lecture, we'll build on this foundation by turning to political ideologies, the belief systems like liberalism, conservatism, and socialism that shape how different people answer the very question we opened with today. Who should get what, when, and how?